Welcome to American Ambition, a history podcast about plans, hopes, and visions for the future of the United States. This is episode 6, Dred Scott and John Brown, the 6th episode in our series tracking the 19th century political crisis that led to the American Civil War in 1861. In this episode, we'll pick up the Kansas-Nebraska Act thread from last time and discuss the violent outbursts that it sparked, both in Kansas and in Washington. Then we'll discuss the Dred Scott case, one of the most important and most disparaged Supreme Court decisions in U.S. history. From there, we'll go on to discuss the abolitionist John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry and its impact of his capture and execution. So a pretty consistent three-act structure today. Bleeding Kansas, to Dred Scott, to John Brown. And that will take us right up to the pivotal election of 1860. The ink was barely dry on the Kansas-Nebraska Act when Kansas became a literal battleground over the future of slavery. In the spring of summer of 1854, pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, determined to claim the neighboring territory for the cause of human enslavement, began pouring into the territory. Not to be outdone, anti-slavery Midwesterners and New Englanders took to the roads with the goal of turning Kansas into a bastion of the Free Soil West. Territorial Governor Andrew Reeder, a Pennsylvania lawyer, would try to establish order, but with little luck. Reeder would be replaced barely a year into his tenure, and the governorship would change hands 4 more times in the next 5 years. Reeder had called for elections for a territorial delegate for Congress, but come election day, the Missourians, dubbed border ruffians by their rivals, swarmed over the border to cast fraudulent votes for the pro-slavery candidate. Missourians employed the same tactics to even greater effect at the elections for a territorial legislature the next spring, intimidating Free Soil voters from even showing up at the polls. To his credit, Reeder said this was no good and tried to call for new elections, but the border ruffians howled and got President Pierce to fire Reeder, who was forced to flee the territory in disguise. The pro-slavery legislature the border ruffians elected wasted no time in establishing some draconian new laws. Criticizing slavery? That's a felony. Helping a slave person escape? That'll be the death penalty. Calling themselves the pro-slavery party, the legislature derided anyone who would question their laws, calling their critics abolitionists and disunionists. The Free Soil settlers, of course, denounced all of this as a perversion of the idea of popular sovereignty and pointed out that they actually outnumbered the pro-slavery settlers. In the fall of 1855, the Free Soil settlers established their own capital and a shadow government in Topeka. The Constitution that this Free Soil government came up with highlighted once again how opposition to slavery and anti-black racism were entirely compatible for many 19th century Americans. That is to say, the Free Soil Convention banned both enslaved people and free black settlers from Kansas. Following the establishment of the Topeka government, pro-slavery settlers and Missouri border ruffians began provoking violent clashes with the Free Soilers, a conflict that quickly became known as Bleeding Kansas. Now, settling a new territory was always a fraught business. People argued over claims to land and water and timber, and now those disputes became increasingly likely to be solved via shotgun. In November 1855, a small army of around 1,500 Missourians menaced the Free Soil town of Lawrence, Kansas, who rallied a militia of nearly 1,000 men to defend the town. In an absurd scene, federal troops who were on hand sat on their hands as they'd received no orders to put a stop to the violence that was about to break out. Fortunately, the new governor, Wilson Shannon, managed to convince the pro-slavery forces to go home. But the arguments he used to accomplish this didn't bode well for future tranquility. Quote, "If you attack Lawrence now," he told them, "you attack as a mob, and what would be the result? You could cause the election of an abolition president and the ruin of the Democratic Party. Wait a little." Unquote. The Missourians took Shannon's advice. They waited a while and came back with a fig leaf of legal legitimacy. In May 1856, pro-slavery judge Samuel LeCompte indicted the Free Soil Topeka government for treason and declared 2 Lawrence newspapers to be, quote, inflammatory and seditious, and declared that they must be suppressed. The very next day, a group of pro-slavery vigilantes arrived in Lawrence, encouraged by former Senator David Atchison to, quote, burn, sack, and destroy until every vestige of these northern abolitionists is wiped out. The vigilantes destroyed the Free State Hotel with a cannon blast and laid waste to the town, destroying or plundering public buildings and private residences alike. It was a display of brazen violence that took the nation by surprise. The ongoing strife in Kansas, including the apparent unwillingness of the pro-slavery crowd to abide by the popular sovereignty doctrine in practice, was a real boon for the emerging Republican Party and the death knell of the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings' first national meeting in 1855 fractured when Southern Know-Nothings passed a resolution in support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this provoked anti-slavery Northern Know-Nothings, who were most of the Northern crowd, to walk out and protest. That fall, Republican Salmon Chase, a former Free Soil Democrat and longtime anti-slavery lawyer, won the Ohio gubernatorial election by co-opting nativist votes for the Republican Party. In New York, Senator William Seward was honing grievances against the slave power conspiracy into a potent political narrative. Slaveholders, he argued, were 1% of the U.S. population, and yet somehow they were allowed to dominate the politics of the whole country. In New York, Senator William Seward was honing grievances against the slave power conspiracy into a potent political narrative. He denounced attempts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act as a, quote, invasion of states' rights, an attempt by the slaveholding states to enforce slavery on the free states. Seward was also talented at using gendered political language to make his case. Pro-slavery Southerners had long denounced anyone with anti-slavery sympathies for being overly emotional and too passionate, characteristics that they associated negatively with femininity. They held up the involvement of women in anti-slavery societies as evidence the abolitionist movement was nothing more than some female emotional fancy that shouldn't be taken seriously. Seward reversed these charges, declaring that he and his allies were calm, rational men who only followed the, quote, impartial counsel of their conscience, while it was Southerners who displayed their uncontrolled emotions with their, quote, perpetual appeals to the ignoble instinct of fear. Seward's rhetoric helped establish the talking points the Republicans used for the rest of the decade. Republicans stood for union and reason, while slaveholders stood for disunion and hysteria. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was another Republican rising to the national stage. Representing Massachusetts in the Senate, Sumner was the only full-throated abolitionist in the body, arguing publicly not just for the end of the expansion of slavery or the dominance of slaveholders, but the end of slavery altogether. Many found the erudite and learned Sumner to be egotistical, arrogant, and pompous, but he was earnest in his convictions. Sumner had a long track record as a lawyer opposing racial segregation in Massachusetts court, and as a result enjoyed many friends and allies among the free black communities of his state. Sumner, naturally, was as enraged about the sack of Lawrence and took to the Senate floor to denounce what he called the crime against Kansas. Pro-slavery forces, he declared, were nothing more than, quote, hirelings, picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. They were sent forth, he said, to accomplish the, quote, rape of a virgin territory, compelling it into the hateful embrace of slavery. Sumner singled out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, who he mocked for, quote, choosing the harlot, slavery, as his mistress. Listening to Sumner's oration, Stephen Douglas is supposed to have remarked, quote, that damn fool was going to get himself killed by some other damn fool. 2 days later, after the Senate adjourned and Sumner was at his desk writing, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina strode into the Senate chamber, marched up to Sumner, announced that his recent speech had slandered both the state and Brooks's cousin, Senator Butler, and with that, Brooks began to beat Sumner over the head with his cane. Brooks' associates kept other lawmakers from intervening, while Sumner's desk, nailed to the floor, kept the senator from escaping. Brooks delivered dozens of blows until his cane literally broke, and he left Sumner bleeding on the floor. Brooks was arrested and fined for his attack, but his outraged colleagues in the House of Representatives could not muster the two-thirds majority necessary to expel him. In a show of defiant bravado, Brooks instead resigned and returned home to South Carolina, where he was immediately reelected. Brooks bragged to his brother that the fragments of the cane he broke attacking Sumner were, quote, begged for as sacred relics. The local South Carolina paper applauded him for giving Sumner, quote, 50 stripes, comparing Brooks' attack on Sumner to the whippings used against enslaved people as punishment. Quote, we feel our representative did exactly right, they continued. The Richmond Enquirer newspaper agreed, declaring that all abolitionists ought to be similarly, quote, lashed into obscurity. Throughout the Deep South, Brooks' actions were applauded. Finally, someone had stood up to the disunion abolitionists and put them in their place. Despite losing his cane in the attack, Brooks could now replace it with one of the dozens sent to him by admirers. To borrow the words of historian Elizabeth Varon, quote, anti-slavery Northerners interpreted this episode as a window into the Southern soul. This was the clearest evidence yet that slaveholders were themselves dominated by what the Albany Evening Journal called the, quote, logic of the plantation, brute force and might. Brooks had profaned the halls of government. He had functionally declared that Northerners and their representatives had no right to criticize slavery, and if they did, they could be arbitrarily subjected to violent physical assault. It was impossible to think Brooks was an aberration of Southern culture when so many fellow Southerners applauded his actions. Brooks' attack and the acclaim he received afterwards made the slave power conspiracy far more convincing. What better evidence could there be that the enslaver class would permit no criticism, would allow no debate? What better example could there be to prove that slaveholders would happily, eagerly sacrifice the rights of free Northerners to the cause of slavery? As I've said before, these arguments about slavery are rarely just about slavery. In the divided reaction to Brooks' attack, we can see how different conceptions of what it meant to be a man in mid-19th century America contributed to divergent perspectives on the assault. Masculinity in the slaveholding states, and particularly among the social elite of those states, was tied up in a conception of personal honor. A proper man behaved with dignity in public to establish an honorable reputation, and he stood ready to defend that honor against any slander with violence if necessary. As a result, duels continued to be fought in these slaveholding states, even as more and more localities outlawed the practice. Therefore, Brooks' attack was consistent with a culture that understood violence to be an appropriate response to an attack on one's family or reputation. Crucially, however, duels were fought only among social equals. Brooks displayed his contempt of Sumner by refusing to adhere to the dueling code for settling disagreements among gentlemen, instead resorting immediately to violent chastisement. Among the middle and upper classes of the free states, however, dueling had long been out of fashion and was regarded as a barbarous practice of a less civilized age. These people tended to instead prize an ideal of masculinity grounded in order, domesticity, and self-restraint. The ideal man was the patriarch of a stable, loving family who ensured calm, rational order in both his public and private affairs. Crucially, he did not allow himself to be overwhelmed by emotion and passion. To lose control of oneself, to cease behaving as a calm and rational patriarch, was to show yourself to be unworthy as a man. Dueling was not the only vice that this ideal of masculinity demanded men refrain from. This ideal also demanded that men should exercise caution when drinking alcohol, and certainly never drink to excess. They should also refrain from anything that appeared to be an emotional outburst, which might be a sign that a man had no control over his emotions, that he could not live up to the civilized ideal of masculinity. And so Brooks' attack, which looked to many Southerners as a justifiable reaction to dishonorable insults by a social inferior, looked to many Northerners like the unhinged behavior of someone who is unfit to be a member in good standing of a supper club, let alone the United States Congress. Brooks' behavior seemed so clearly correct or so clearly wrong that to hear that anyone else felt differently than you made you question their whole conception of civilization. What sort of world do they want to live in anyway, where a man could be celebrated or reprimanded for behaving as he had? To many a Northerner, Brooks' attack showed wealthy Southerners to be savage barbarians. To many a Southerner, it was Sumner's speech that there was the dishonorable attack, and Northerners' condemnation of Brooks showed that they had no idea what true honor meant or what a man must do to defend it. Between the violence in Kansas and the assault in the Senate, it seemed to anti-slavery Northerners that the mask had finally slipped. Enslavers had always been violent people, they said, but they did their violence in their own homes and against their enslaved people. Now they had begun using violence not just against disobedient enslaved people, but against disobedient Northerners who refused to roll over and let the enslavers dominate the Union indefinitely. Now, Northerners worried more and more that slaveholders would dominate the Union indefinitely, because, at least according to the Supreme Court, it was illegal to ban slavery anywhere in America. Allow me to explain. Back in 1799, a man named Dred Scott was born into slavery in Southampton County, Virginia, the very place where, 30 years later, Nat Turner would launch his famous rebellion. Scott was not there at the time of the rebellion, however. In 1830, he was brought west along with the family that owned him, the Blows. The Blows settled in Missouri and soon sold Scott to an army doctor, John Emerson, who took Scott with him as he moved between several army bases along the Mississippi. They spent a year at Fort Armstrong in Illinois near Davenport, and then another 2 or 3 at Fort Snelling, which was then part of the Wisconsin Territory and now is part of Minnesota. There, Scott met Harriet Robinson, a woman enslaved by another army officer, and the two married. In 1840, when Emerson returned to Missouri, the Scotts, of course, went with him, and when Emerson died 3 years later, they became the property of his wife, Eliza. Now, why does all this back and forth matter, you may wonder? Well, it matters because Scott had some unusual good fortune. He remained on good terms with the Blows, the family in St. Louis that had sold him over a decade ago, and with their help, he filed a lawsuit to claim his freedom in 1846. Scott's argument was quite simple. While he had been enslaved by Emerson, Scott had resided in both a free state, Illinois, and a free territory, Wisconsin. This, Scott argued, made him a free man, even after he returned to Missouri. It sounds simple, and indeed, Missouri courts had long ruled in favor of enslaved people in similar cases. And indeed, Scott prevailed in St. Louis District Court, only for the decision to be overturned by the Missouri Supreme Court on appeal. A federal district court upheld this ruling in 1854, at which point the Scotts had been suing for their freedom for 8 years. Fortunately, they secured the help of Montgomery Blair, a Free Soil politician and lawyer from an influential Missouri family, who agreed to appeal the case to the Supreme Court pro bono. The court heard the case twice and then rendered their verdict in early 1857. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time was a Marylander and a Jackson appointee named Roger Taney. Taney was ardently pro-slavery and deeply worried about the escalating tensions in the country. He saw both the rabid fire-eaters to the south and the fervent abolitionists of the north as dangerous radicals driving the country towards bloodshed. So, he took Dred Scott's case and devised a solution that would mollify slaveholders and enrage Northerners. He would stop abolitionist agitation by taking the issue of slavery expansion away from Congress, where anti-slavery congressmen were being so annoying, and he would mollify Southern radicals by guaranteeing slavery throughout the country. Taney was of a mind to issue a sweeping pro-slavery decision, and he had the justices to do it. 5 of the 9 justices, including Taney, were from slave states, and 7 had been appointed by pro-slavery presidents. Taney did not want the decision to appear regionally biased, however, and so with the help of recently elected President James Buchanan, Taney got the support of Justices Samuel Nelson of New York and Robert Greer of Pennsylvania. In March of 1857, the Supreme Court issued their decision. In one of the most infamous judgments ever handed down from that court, Taney and a majority of the justices ruled that Scott had no standing to appeal because he was black, and therefore not a citizen, and therefore could not bring a lawsuit in federal court. In a deliberate misreading of American law and history, Taney projected the pro-slavery racism of the 1850s backwards 70 years, arguing that the framers of the Constitution had never intended black people to be citizens of the United States. In the most notorious portion of an exceptionally long opinion, Tawney declared, quote, "In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people. They had been for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race either on social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect." Unquote. Even at a time when anti-black racism was the norm among white American society, it was an astonishingly harsh and specific repudiation of the humanity of black Americans. There, things should have ended. As woefully misguided as Tawney was, that was the end of the case. Scott was not a citizen. He could not sue in federal court. He was bound by the decision of the Missouri Supreme Court, which had declared him enslaved. But Tawney did not stop there. He proceeded to then offer his opinions on the merits of the anti-slavery laws of Wisconsin and Illinois, matters that were, legally speaking, no longer before the court. This is an important point, and I want to emphasize it, because what Tawney does here is bizarre, and it's going to make folks angry. Scott had appealed an earlier verdict, arguing that he was free due to the anti-slavery laws on the books in Wisconsin and Illinois. But when Tawney declared Scott not a citizen, then the case is over. Those questions of the laws of Wisconsin and Illinois are irrelevant because, according to Tawney, the Supreme Court shouldn't even be hearing this appeal from a non-citizen. But Tawney wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to rule that black people aren't citizens, and he wanted to rule on the laws of Wisconsin and Illinois. And so he just kind of kept going, even though he now strayed into territory where, according to his own ruling and his own logic on Scott's citizenship, he really had no place being. Tawney's opinion went on to argue the radical idea that the Wisconsin territory was not, in fact, free territory, and never could be free territory because Congress lacked the power to ban slavery in the territories. His fringe reading of the Constitution was that that document only gave Congress authority over the territory it had held in 1787 when it was adopted, which was a highly unusual reading of the Constitution that only the most radical pro-slavery folks supported. Tawney went on to argue that the Fifth Amendment guarantees not to deprive Americans of their property without due process, that these protected enslaved property throughout the United States and its territories. This meant it was effectively impossible to make slavery illegal anywhere. Tawney declared, in effect, that the U.S. Constitution did not permit any limits on where people could be enslaved. There are times when we look back at a historical figure like Tawney and lament that they were a product of their times, that their views were necessarily limited by the cultural milieu they lived in. And while there's sometimes some truth to this, we shouldn't forget to overlook people who emerged from a similar place and time and were able to look beyond their cultural blinders and accurately identify their contemporaries' bullshit. You see, 2 of the 9 justices dissented from the Dred Scott decision, and Justice Benjamin Curtis was also on the Supreme Court, and he thought that Tawney was completely off his rocker. And his opinion carried particular weight because it wasn't like Curtis was some sort of anti-slavery firebrand. He was an old Massachusetts conservative. He'd been appointed specifically because of his support of the Fugitive Slave Act. In his dissent, Curtis systematically dismantled Tawney's argument with a reasoned analysis of law and history that more or less holds up to this day. Curtis pointed out that numerous states, including New Jersey, New York, and New Hampshire, had allowed black residents to vote at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. To presume, he argued, that the people given the power to accept or reject the Constitution were not citizens was absurd. Summarizing prodigious historical research, Curtis stated bluntly, quote, "In the apprehension of the framers, color was not a necessary qualification of citizenship, unquote. Curtis next addressed the question of congressional jurisdiction over the territories, pointing out that the Constitutional Convention debates and Federalist Papers written to defend the Constitution made it clear that those who wrote the document intended Congress to have continuing jurisdiction over any territories they acquired. More to the point, he argued, this was the precedent that had been set over the course of nearly 80 years of governance. If Tawney was going to argue that this was not how things should be done, he was going to need some better evidence. Finally, Curtis pointed out that Tawney's logic regarding the Fifth Amendment rights of enslavers was patently absurd. Both the federal government and numerous state governments, Curtis pointed out, had laws banning international slave trading. If a U.S. citizen showed up on U.S. shores with illegally imported enslaved people, they were declared free. No one was arguing that you could not be deprived of your enslaved people under those circumstances for breaking the laws established regarding slavery. How were territorial regulations or free states' anti-slavery laws any different? In short, Curtis's dissent publicly explained for anybody to read how tortured logic and deliberate misreadings of history had guided Tawney's decision. Curtis's arguments, unfortunately, were a dissent. They were not the binding opinion of the court. But they gave anti-slavery Northerners a versatile framework to criticize the Dred Scott decision. They rejected Tawney's logic, especially his rulings on the territories, because those arguments, they argued, were merely dicta. They were the words of the court, but because they were unrelated to the case at hand, they were not legally binding. The Dred Scott decision fed fuel to the flames of the slave power conspiracy. Here was clear evidence that slaveholders were willing to wipe away law, precedent, and reason, determined to spread their vile system of human bondage across the country. Clearly, the slaveholders had corrupted the entire government, passing unjust laws, perjuring the courts, and placing a Northern lackey in the White House in the form of the Democrat Party hack James Buchanan. Southerners, on the other hand, reveled in the decision. Now, if Northerners rejected the Supreme Court, they would be the ones rejecting law and order. This would expose the abolitionists as the fanatics they were, determined to turn the whole country against the South. The Milledgeville Union newspaper in Georgia declared that the quote-unquote enemies of the South would be engaging in treason if they did not stand with the quote Union men of the country in sustaining the determination of the Supreme Court. Another Georgia paper gloated, quote, Southern opinion upon the subject of slavery is now the supreme law of the land. The New Orleans Picayune crowed that Tawney's decision, quote, crushes the life out of the miserable Black Republican organization. Black Republican being, of course, a common term of disparagement for the Republican Party. Now, to understand how Southerners and Northerners took such different stances on the Dred Scott decision, it's necessary to consider the context of the last 35 years. This is why I started the series where I did, and not in, say, 1845, right as the whole Texas and Mexico thing was kicking off. To a pro-slavery Southerner, it seems that for the last 35 years at least, Northerners have not been treating the South as an equal partner in the Union. By trying to bar the expansion of slavery with the Missouri Compromise, Northerners tried to prevent the South from expanding, from participating in the future of the country. By sending anti-slavery literature south, Northerners proved that they cared nothing for Southern protests, even when their very lives might be at stake. When the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, Northern states responded with unconstitutional personal liberty laws. Only now, with Tawney's decision, were slaveholders guaranteed their deserved equal standing as citizens throughout the country, a status that Northerners had denied them for decades. For anti-slavery Northerners, on the other hand, Tawney's decision was only the most recent and flagrant aggression by the avaricious slave power. Never content with slavery where it already existed, Southerners had dragged the country into war to seize a massive new domain for slavery. They had forced Northerners to be their slave catchers and reneged on any promise they made not to extend the practice still further. All the while, slaveholders denied Northerners' rights in order to protect their own slave property. Any criticism of slavery was met with fire, bullets, and blows. And so finally, the slaveholder class produced an egregious usurpation of law to justify their own greed and violence. Dred Scott himself did soon achieve his freedom, fortunately. In the years since the case had begun, Emerson's wife Eliza had remarried, and neither she nor her new husband were committed to slavery. Following the decision, they formally ceded Scott to Taylor Blow, a Republican congressman from Missouri and the son of the man who had owned Scott and brought him west and sold him. Blow promptly freed Scott, who lived and worked in St. Louis until his death of tuberculosis a year later. So, to summarize, Dred Scott had sued for his freedom in the 1840s with a reasonable expectation, based on legal precedent in Missouri, of winning his case. He did not win, however, and his eventual appeal to the Supreme Court gave Chief Justice Taney an opportunity to try to settle the issue of slavery in the territories once and for all. Taney's decision, remanding Scott to slavery and decreeing all congressional limits on slavery unconstitutional, was greeted with cheers in the South and disgust in the North. While pro-slavery Americans welcomed this as the final verdict, anti-slavery Americans pointed to the obviously strained legal reasoning and declared that the courts, too, had been corrupted by the slave power. Now, Taney may have decreed that the Constitution protected slavery everywhere and forever, but there were some who had in mind a new Constitution. In May 1858, an abolitionist named John Brown sponsored a constitutional convention in Chatham, Ontario, near Detroit, where he promulgated a document he called the, quote, Provisional Constitution and Ordinances for the People of the United States. In a deliberate refutation of Taney, Brown sought to, quote, amend and repeal the Constitution and replace it with something far more egalitarian. Brown had a plan, you see. He had learned the guerrilla tactics that the Spanish had used to resist the invasion of Napoleon. For all the troops mustered in the Emperor's Grand Army, they had found that they could not defeat the Spaniards who resorted to raids and ambushes, keeping the indomitable Napoleon bogged down for years. He also knew of the Caribbean people known as Maroons, communities of people who had escaped enslavement and resisted recapture by taking to the mountains. In Jamaica, for instance, Maroon communities had won formal recognition in 1740 when the British discovered that they could not penetrate the mountainous jungle where the Maroons had made their home. These struggles against invasion and oppression were Brown's inspiration for a new anti-slavery fight in America. Brown and a small army would strike in a slave state. They would capture the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. They would abscond with a stash of arms and munitions, distribute them to the enslaved people of the surrounding area, and together flee into the mountains like the Spanish guerrillas and Jamaican Maroons, where they would form a free bastion in the heart of slavery, that all who would be free could escape to. Brown and his growing band of freedom fighters would then launch raids throughout slave country, freeing and arming the enslaved and growing their Maroon community. They would dismantle slavery by giving the enslaved the tools to free themselves. They would be a flag to rally to for an enslaved person that wished to strike back against their oppressors. It was an ambitious plan. The only thing more ambitious may have been Brown's Constitution and Ordinances. On the one hand, it might seem like a bland document, laying out the structure of government, executive offices, a legislature, courts, etc., etc. On the other hand, it was a radically egalitarian and inclusive vision of a new United States. Membership and participation in Brown's organization, as he put it, was open to, quote, all persons of mature age who agreed to support the Constitution and ordinances. Nothing in the document laid out any formal distinction between man and woman, blacks, whites, Indians, or anyone else. Indeed, the attendees of Brown's Chatham meeting elected several black people to offices in this new government. Non-capital crimes under Brown's new government would be punished with labor upon public works and roads. All things produced by Brown's organization would be, quote, held as property of the whole, equally and without distinction. It was an almost utopian plan for a new egalitarian future. This was Brown at his best. His new classless future was, however, premised on a good bit of violence, something that would have been no surprise to anybody who had known him for the last several years. Since he had publicly committed himself to combating slavery following the death of Elijah Lovejoy at the hands of a pro-slavery mob back in 1837, Brown had been itching for a fight. He found it in Kansas, where he moved along with his sons to confront the pro-slavery forces. He was outraged by the sack of Lawrence, but he was not there to confront the mob that burned the town. Brown wanted vengeance, and so 3 days after the attack on Lawrence, he and a band of Free Soil partisans broke into the homes of pro-slavery settlers in the dead of night and murdered 5 of them with sabers and pistols in front of their own families. Known as the Potawatomi Massacre, Brown's attack went down as one of the most notorious acts of all the violence that befell the territory of Kansas. Brown, like so many other abolitionists, was a devout Christian, but he had little use for the pacifism of men like Garrison. His God was not Christ who went humbly to the cross, but Jehovah, who drowned Pharaoh's army beneath the Red Sea. In Brown's words, slavery was a, quote, most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war. And those who go to war can make no complaint of the violence done against them. Brown secured support for his plan from a number of prominent Northern abolitionists. Dubbed the Secret Six, they financed Brown as he rented a farm in Maryland and gathered arms for the planned invasion. He sought, but did not receive, the aid of Frederick Douglass. Douglass disagreed with Brown in principle that violence was an acceptable means in the struggle against slavery. Douglass had recounted in his own autobiography how he had physically fought back against an overseer when he had been enslaved. Following the Fugitive Slave Act, he felt that there was no other course than, quote, forcible resistance to a law that would make slaves of any captured black person. Quote, the only way to make the fugitive slave law a dead letter is to make 6 or more dead kidnappers, Douglass wrote. But Douglass thought Brown's plan would accomplish little but to bring down the whole country upon him. That such an attack, specifically Brown's plan to begin the liberation struggle by seizing a federal arsenal, would invite a swift and overwhelming response. "You will never get out alive," Douglass warned Brown. Nevertheless, Brown recruited a band of 21 followers, including several of his own sons, to launch his attack, and he chose October 16th, 1859, as the day of reckoning. Now, despite what I just laid out to you, it is difficult to say at this point, a year and a half since his convention at Chatham, exactly what Brown's plan was. He authored a vindication of the invasion in the past tense, almost as if he believed his plan would fail. On the one hand, this may have simply been an effort to leave behind a record, in his own words, in the event of a failure. Dwight Eisenhower, for example, did something similar before D-Day, writing a message to the American people that would only be publicized if the Normandy landings were repulsed. When undertaking something audacious, it's prudent to plan for all possibilities. But given Brown's behavior during the raid itself and afterwards, which we'll discuss, it does beg the question whether Brown planned to be captured or killed. Brown left behind many bold declarations, but few detailed discussions of his internal thought process. He was famously tight-lipped about his plans, even with his closest followers. The gaps between his declarations and his actions have left space for many in the years since to read what they want to into his life. On the night of October 16th, 1859, Brown left 3 of his men behind to guard the farm and descended on Harper's Ferry with 18 men under the cover of darkness. The seizure of the armory was easy. It was guarded by a single night watchman. Brown had not, as he planned earlier, sent advance word to enslaved people in the area to expect his raid and rally to his cause. But with the armory in hand, Brown now dispatched some of his men to the countryside to rouse local enslaved people to rise and join him. They also took several hostages and began loading weapons from the arsenal into wagons to carry them out of town. When the midnight eastbound train arrived in Harper's Ferry, Brown's men stopped it, inadvertently killing a black porter in the process. Then, inexplicably, Brown allowed the train to go on, carrying with it news of his raid. The next morning, instead of making a rapid escape, Brown remained in Harper's Ferry, coordinating the wagon loads of weapons and negotiating the fate of the hostages. This delay would prove a critical misstep, as it allowed Brown's enemies time to recover from the shock he'd given them and muster a response. Throughout October 17th, the townspeople of Harper's Ferry, supplemented with local militia, surrounded the armory and exchanged shots with Brown's men. 8 of the raiders were killed, as well as 3 of the townspeople, while several other raiders made their escape from what they were worried had become a suicide mission. Brown retreated with a skeleton crew and some hostages to a sturdy firehouse, where they awaited the inevitable. That night, a detachment of U.S. Marines arrived, commanded by a brevet colonel named Robert Lee. After a brief attempt at negotiating Brown's surrender, they broke down the door with a battering ram and attacked with bayonets, killing 2 more of Brown's band and capturing 7 others, including Brown himself. Brown was brought to nearby Charlestown, where authorities planned to try him quickly in order to prevent a lynching. The reaction across Virginia and the South was shock and fury. The whole region was overtaken by a frantic rumor and speculation that John Brown had only been the first of many coming assassins, that a greater uprising was still to come. To the north, many reacted with a sort of bemused confusion. An anti-slavery newspaper in Massachusetts labeled the raid, quote, one of the rashest and maddest enterprises ever. But then came Brown's trial and execution. Brown was charged with treason, murder, and insurrection, and was convicted. Pro-slavery Southerners were relieved. There had been no further invasions. The miscreant Brown would get what he deserved. They could sleep easy in the knowledge that Brown was, perhaps, a lone fanatic. But Brown was not going to make things that simple. He was now very much determined to go down a martyr, convinced that in death he could do far more for the abolitionist cause than in life. Quote, I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose, he wrote to his brother. In his final remarks before sentencing, Brown declared, quote, I deny everything but what I have long admitted, of a design on my part to free the slaves. Had I interfered in the manner which I admit on behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. Wearing a long, flowing beard like a prophet from the days of the Old Testament, Brown went to his death delivering a final foretelling of the war to come. A note he handed his guard before he ascended the gallows read in part, quote, I, John Brown, am now quite certain the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. Speaking to an audience that knew their Bible well, he was perhaps alluding to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, quote, without shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Or perhaps he was simply very sure that many more people would die before slavery came to an end. Either way, he left a prophetic last message, and with that, he was executed by the Commonwealth of Virginia. When Brown was arrested, he had seemed a violent fanatic, a harebrained schemer, a doomed zealot. But as he played the role of the martyred Christian at his trial and execution, many Northerners experienced a change of heart. And so it was that Brown died a doomed hero, a tragic apostle of freedom. When Brown was hung on December 2nd, 1859, church bells tolled across the North as the people mourned the martyr. I have seen nothing like it, wrote an awed Charles Eliot Norton in Massachusetts. In Lawrence, Kansas, the town Brown had once so brutally avenged, the local paper declared that, quote, the death of no man in America has ever produced so profound a sensation. A feeling of deep and sorrowful indignation seems to possess the masses. Ralph Waldo Emerson made the comparison to Christ explicit, writing that Brown made the, quote, gallows as glorious as the cross. More ominously, Walt Whitman called Brown a meteor, likening him to those celestial objects that in less enlightened times had heralded instability, disorder, and chaos. In countless publications across the North, Northerners drew a distinction between Brown's violent acts, which they admonished, and his noble purpose, for which they had nothing but acclaim. As you might imagine, the verdict across the slaveholding states was more critical. In Georgia, the Albany Patriot was unequivocal. Quote, an undivided South says, let him hang. To white Southerners, Brown's violent behavior and his emancipatory goals were a distinction without a difference. Northern approbation of Brown sounded very much like support for murderous slave insurrection and race war. Politicians and newspaper editors who had been advocates of moderation suddenly embraced the pro-slavery appeals of the advocates of secession. Quote, "The Harper's Ferry invasion has advanced the cause of disunion more than any other event," wrote the Richmond Enquirer. Elizabeth Vancleave, one of a dwindling number of Union supporters in Richmond, despaired that, quote, "there is no denying that our people were in a palpable state of war since the time of the John Brown raid." Even those who did not make the conversion to secessionism, and there were still plenty, had had their faith in their northern neighbors profoundly shaken. In the words of a Baltimore newspaper, could white Southerners afford to, quote, "live under a government the majority of whose subjects and citizens regard John Brown as a martyr and a Christian hero?" One North Carolinian described his changing perspective in 1859, writing, quote, "I have always been a fervent Union man, but I confess the endorsement of the Harper's Ferry outrage has shaken my fidelity. I am willing to take the chances every possible evil that may rise from disunion, sooner than submit any longer to Northern insolence." John Brown is perhaps one of the best examples of the saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. His raid raises some profound moral and practical dilemmas even now. How should one confront an unjust state? Is it right to resort to violence in the name of freedom and justice? Is it better to die for a cause or to live to fight another day? Rather than stray into the realm of moral and political philosophy, though, I'd like to end this episode by instead advocating against a particular historical interpretation of John Brown. I want to push back against the interpretation of Brown as crazy, as someone disturbed or unwell, an impression that sometimes makes its way even into sympathetic portrayals of the man. And I'll mention two reasons for this. First, I think that framing of him, to accept some mental illness or incapacity as an explanation for his behavior, is to accept Brown's enemies' position and their underlying assumptions, that any white person who cared that much about enslaved people must be off their rocker. Very radical white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown were often denounced by those who opposed them as insane, based solely on the evidence that they believed in the human dignity and equality of enslaved people. More generally, I don't think it enlightens us much to explain past humans' behavior as crazy. People do things for reasons that sometimes only make sense to them, reasons that are sometimes contradictory, reasons that they sometimes can't fully explain to themselves. But if you're trying to explain someone's behavior, you should, I think, focus on those reasons in as far as you can figure them out. In Brown's case, we know enough about him to construct a pretty plausible case that, in fact, he was violently opposed to slavery because he believed it contradicted the will of God, and that almost all of his actions can be explained in one way or another by his intense religious faith, his desire to do good, and his willingness to resort to violence to accomplish those ends. He was one of thousands of Americans who embraced an intense, personal, evangelical faith and turned that zealotry towards the anti-slavery cause. What appears to some to be suicidal planning seems to me to be simple mismanaged priorities and poor tactical decision-making in a high-pressure life-and-death situation. Maybe Brown just bit off a bit more than he could chew and was in over his head. At the end of the day, Brown was an intensely religious and violent man in an era steeped with intense religion and frequent violence. I think it is possible that he was an outlier compared to his contemporaries without being an aberration. John Brown has been one of the more polarizing figures in American history, more or less since the day he declared war on slavery. His failed raid on Harper's Ferry and subsequent execution is a useful bookend with the attack on Sumner, to highlight how Northerners and Southerners began to see each other not just as different, but as antagonistic. Following Sumner's attack, Northerners were incensed at this barbarity, and were then aghast when many Southerners celebrated the attack. Brown's raid left many Southerners fearing for their lives, and they were outraged when so many Northerners seemed to be willing to excuse or even applaud the attacker. John Brown expected more blood to be shed, and his death helped make that true, by pushing the hostility between the regions to a near fever pitch. To close, I want to foreshadow next episode by talking briefly about this interregional hostility. Because white Southerners asked themselves, who was to blame for the radicalization of the North? Who was responsible for this antagonism from their countrymen? And the answer to many was clear: the Republican Party. Since around 1856, the Republican Party had enjoyed a sort of boogeyman status among white Southerners. At first, the Republicans seemed like just another of those crazy fringe anti-slavery parties. The Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party. Maybe they'd elect some congressmen, but there's nothing they could do nationally. Then, Bleeding Kansas happened. The opening of free territory to slavery and the violence of the pro-slavery border ruffians began to convince even skeptical Northerners that whatever they thought of the abolitionists, the slaveholders were a bigger threat. And so, for the first time in 1856, an anti-slavery party won electoral votes. The Republicans were officially a force to be reckoned with. Now, both Northern Democrats and pro-slavery Southerners vilified Republicans as black Republicans who were no better than the most radical abolitionists, supporters of racial equality and interracial marriage. Attacks like John Brown's were, to quote Stephen Douglas, the, quote, natural, logical, and inevitable result of the doctrines and teachings of the Republican Party. William Seward, a governor and later senator from New York, became the face of Republican villainy. In 1850, Seward had given a speech in which he declared that there was a, quote, higher law than the Constitution, by which he meant that slavery was so wrong, no law could make it right. But many pro-slavery folks took him to mean that he rejected the Constitution. Slavery caused controversy again in the wake of Brown's raid, when he gave another speech in which he referred to a, quote, irrepressible conflict between freedom and slavery. He likely felt that he was just describing an obvious situation. But of course, to his enemies, this was clear evidence that Seward was a radical who would brook no compromise with the South. But many, in fact, most Republicans were not hardcore abolitionists. They opposed the expansion of slavery and were very interested in portraying themselves as moderate, reasonable people who could be trusted to combat the hysterical pro-slavery secessionist faction. Abraham Lincoln was a prime example of the more moderate faction that dominated the party. Lincoln studiously condemned Brown's raid as ill-advised and unacceptable. He and his allies explained Brown's violence as the natural outgrowth of Southern pro-slavery violence, arguing that Southerners were the ones ratcheting up tensions, while sober Republicans tried to keep order. In an early speech in his as-yet unannounced bid for the presidency, Lincoln spoke at Cooper Union Hall in New York. There he laid out the moderate Republican position with great effect, tabulating all the founding fathers, 36 of 39 by his count, who had approved of the restriction of the expansion of slavery, and arguing that he and his fellow Republicans were no radical firebrands, but reasonable, moderate, even conservative men who just wanted to bring about the founders' vision. In a memorable turn of phrase, Lincoln mocked pro-slavery Southerners who claimed that Northern fanaticism was pushing them towards secession. A sort of, look what you made us do excuse for disunion. This would be, rather like, Lincoln explained, a highway robber who demanded a traveler's valuables by declaring, stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be a murderer. American Ambition is performed by me, Stefan Lund, and edited and produced by Luke Vancleave. Our theme music is also by Luke. Thanks for listening, and join us next time for our 7th and final episode of this series, where we'll discuss the fateful 1860 presidential election, the secession winter, and the outbreak of the American Civil War.